You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Should Seattle City Council members have to recuse themselves if a policy proposal would directly help or harm their self-interests? That's been the guidance here in Seattle for the last 40 years. But a new proposal from City Council member Cathy Moore could change that. The idea to change ethics rules for the council comes ahead of contentious debates related to tenant protections and eviction laws in the city. And it's set to go before the council's governance committee today, this afternoon. Seattle Times City Hall reporter David Kroman is here to explain. Hey, David, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what are the current ethics rules around what votes council members can take, David, and when do they have to recuse?
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, which is if you could actually or be seen to have a financial interest in a vote, you were supposed to recuse yourself. This oftentimes comes up. It's pretty regular for city council people to be landlords, have an ADU or something that they rent out. And so they have to consider whether or not they're allowed to vote on a landlord-tenant related issue, or if somebody has a small family restaurant and they're voting on wage laws or, app-based regulations, they would have to recuse themselves. The idea being if they have a perceived financial interest in something they're voting on, they shouldn't be allowed to vote on it.
Yeah, you're alluding to some of the recent ways this has affected policy decisions. Give me some more specifics. I mean, the app-based issue affected the way that former council member Tanya Wu could vote, right? I mean, what are some examples of how this has affected recent votes?
Yeah, exactly. It's just in this last year, there were probably two main examples, one that actually came up and then another that sort of derailed a possible legislative effort. So the first was this proposal from Council President Sarah Nelson to rewrite the city's wage laws for app-based delivery drivers. So these are drivers on DoorDash or Uber Eats. Um, it was proving to be sort of a tight vote for Council President Nelson, and it became even tighter when the city's ethics commission told former council member Tanya Wu that she should recuse herself because her husband and father-in-law own KUOW Barbecue. KUOW Barbecue gets a lot of business through these apps. Therefore, there's sort of a perceived conflict of interest because she's voting to change the laws that could, in theory, benefit her family. The other piece was around a kind of briefly proposed extension of the tip credit. This year, a credit for tips was scheduled to expire for small businesses. The city council was considering extending that credit, but it came up that, again, Councilmember Wu and Council President Sarah Nelson, who has a stake in Fremont Brewing that she helped found, might not have been able to vote on that issue. And so, there were a few reasons that didn't go forward, but that was a big one, which is that two key votes were probably not going to be able to participate.
Yeah, where the tips were allowed to be counted towards the minimum wage. That was expiring. They wanted to extend, and that fizzled. How are benefits decided, the financial benefits, David? I mean, for example, if you are somebody who's in a union household, like your spouse is a member of a union, does that mean that you recuse from votes related to labor issues?
Yeah, it's a bit of an art, not exactly a science. So the city's code says that if the vote that you're taking is sort of narrowly tailored to you, so you exist within a fairly narrow demographic. So, not a lot of people in Seattle own small businesses. That qualifies. But if the vote you're taking affects a broad swath of people, so for example, if they're voting on raising property taxes, for example, that will affect financially all of the city council people that are sitting on the dais. But at the same time, it will affect everybody in the city. And so that's seen as sort of a broad enough vote that people are allowed to vote on that. So something like union, that's actually an interesting question. I don't know if it's ever been tested, but I think the argument there would be, union affiliation is a broad enough definition
Mm-hmm.
that you couldn't sort of conceivably argue that the vote they were taking was specifically to benefit themselves rather than a broad swath of Seattle.
Yeah. So Cathy Moore has put this forward, Councilmember Moore, to change the ethics rules, loosen the restrictions. What exactly would be changed?
Yeah, the swap is pretty simple. It says that instead of being required to recuse, you would just need to disclose your financial interests. So if this was in effect, Tanya Wu on that app-based delivery bill we talked about, rather than not being allowed to vote, could have, before the vote said, hey, my family owns this restaurant. We might see some financial change from this law. I want you all to know that. And then here's my vote.
And I think a lot of people lean forward when they're like, okay, the city council trying to change its own ethics rules. What's the argument that Moore is putting forward that needs to happen?
Well, the first kind of key piece is that she's proposing this because the head of the city's ethics commission, Wayne Barnett, is pushing for this change, which is, I think, maybe a little counterintuitive to some folks. And his argument has been, we live in a district-based council system now, which means that uh, instead of in pre 2013, when everybody in Seattle would have basically 9 representatives because they were all citywide, now you really only have 3. You have 1 district and 2 citywide. So if your district council person is not allowed to vote, you have just lost whatever 33% of your representation on that particular issue. So he saw it as a disenfranchisement issue. The other piece is I think there was a sense that this ethics process was starting to be politicized a little bit, that opponents of certain proposals were, really sort of making, using this process to try and pick off votes. And I think he felt really uncomfortable being in that position where his decisions were altering the end result of legislation that he felt like if people didn't like it, they would have the opportunity to actually to weigh in on that the next election.
And it sounds like Wayne Barnett was getting uncomfortable with how much the ethics office was sort of putting a thumb on the scale eventually with the outcome of these votes and issues, right? Like he doesn't like the fact that the ethics questions are deciding these major policy changes.
Yeah, exactly. So he was just getting pretty uncomfortable that, particularly, the app-based delivery driver vote that probably would have passed if Councilmember Wu didn't have to recuse herself. And so he was feeling pretty uncomfortable that, there was a perception, real or not, that this kind of, he's not elected. Wayne Barnett does not go before voters. So he was getting uncomfortable with this perception that this unelected body was influencing the final outcome and the priorities of people who had been duly elected. And, there's the argument, too, that, someone like Councilmember Wu was elected explicitly because her family had connections to a small business. And yet the laws were saying because of that same connection that she wouldn't be allowed to vote on this bill.
Yeah, if voters sent her there knowing this is part of her background, we like that, and then she's not able to actually weigh in on the issues that affect small businesses, that doesn't seem to be along the lines of the will of the voter. But let's talk about pushback here, David. I mean, first off, how have other council members reacted? I know at least one, Dan Strauss, has come out against this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of 2 levels to it. There's perception and reality, and there's an argument for both of those things not being particularly great for this vote. So on perception, it's a council voting to change its ethics laws and make it easier for people to have a say in matters that might affect their bottom line at a time when, trust in government is pretty low. So Councilmember Strauss, Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink have both come out and said, I suppose I'm willing to listen to your arguments here, but I just truly do not understand the timing of this because the headlines are going to be the Seattle City Council rolls back its ethics laws at a time when people just frankly are feeling a little disillusioned with government more broadly. So that's the perception piece. And then, the reality is it will make it easier for people to take votes on matters that could improve their financial situation if it passes. So again, we're talking about KUOW Barbecue and Councilmember Tanya Wu. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but a large percentage of that restaurant's business was coming from app-based orders. And by changing that law, the argument was that would improve their bottom line, and therefore Councilmember Tanya Wu would have more money in her bank account. And so, that is the argument against it, which is elected people should just never be in the position to enrich themselves intentionally or not. It's hard to read into their heart of hearts, but should not be put in a position to enrich themselves via legislative policy.
I'm curious if this goes through, David, how much then will change about elections? I mean, at this point, somebody's personal conflict of interest doesn't necessarily come up a lot in the elections process. And maybe it should. I mean, maybe there should be more conversation about that for voters to really take a hard look at how they feel about landlords voting on tenants' protections, things like that. I mean, on the subject of landlords, Has there been conversation about forcing somebody to divest from assets, like sell rental property when they take office?
No, I have never heard that argument before. But, as far as its role in elections, that is actually an argument that Cathy Moore and Wayne Barnett are making for why this change is important. Because right now, if you have to recuse yourself from a vote, there's no obligation that you go before voters and explain your recusal. You just don't show up that day. They're saying, hey, if we change this to a disclosure, you have to sit there on the dais and explain this conflict of interest in public.
Hmm.
And that will create a situation where people know about this when you're on the ballot next. But as far as any sort of forced divestitures, there haven't been any sort of specific examples. It's just there have been a few council people that used to own and rent property. They don't anymore. I don't know whether that their decision to not be in that line of business has anything to do with their role on city council. But no, I haven't seen. I haven't. There's no sort of formal process to force elected people to sell off assets.
But there are currently council members who do rent property out, right? They are small landlords on the council.
Yeah, so Councilmember Maritza Rivera has a small rental near Green Lake that brings her family a modest income. It's not huge, but her family is literally a landlord, and so if they take votes on landlord-tenant regulations, theoretically that would affect how they do business.
I mentioned up top that this could change the face of the debate over tenant protections. Just really quickly before we go, what is that looking like? Like, what kinds of tenant protections could be changed and regulations over rental property could be changed going forward? And how much would the recusal or non-recusal matter in those potential votes?
So there has been this sort of long expected legislation coming out of Cathy Moore's office. We don't know when it's supposed to come out or exactly what it'll say, but the expectation is it would have, create some kind of revisions to the city's current landlord tenant regulations, particularly around when landlords can evict tenants and also the amount of upfront screening landlords are allowed to do of new tenants. This legislation is coming because, actually affordable housing providers are saying that they're having a really difficult time financially, and these regulations might have something to do with that. But, it's going to be a contentious vote because these were important regulations for past progressive city councils. And, it's hard to do exactly vote counting, but there are enough swing votes on this council that even one person recusing themselves, as we saw with the outpaced delivery regulation, could make a difference about whether or not it passes.
Seattle Times City Hall reporter David Kroman. Always good to have you on the show, David. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.